Hi everybody, the video today is all about how to motivate your dog to get the best possible performance out of it by understanding the strengths and benefits of operant conditioning, which is effectively cause and effect based learning. So let's talk about the role of reward and punishment in the context of motivating dogs to do the work that we want them to do on a day-to-day basis. And in order to do that, we need to take a step back and look at the psychology behind what we are trying to teach the dog. What I want to talk about today is what we call operant conditioning. And while it sounds like a big term, operant conditioning basically means a mode of learning that puts the recipient into a position of choice. I either do things or I don't do things. And the decisions that I make are based on the circumstances around my decision. So humans, we go through life effectively making those decisions. Some decisions are moral, some decisions are emotional, some decisions are factual. So what we're trying to do in the context of dog training is to streamline the process and make it really, really simple for the dog to understand, well, everything that you do is cause and effect, and there are certain behaviors that you do that will produce one outcome and certain behaviors that you do will produce another outcome. Well, to better understand the whole concept of operant conditioning, what I want to do today is talk about a document that was generated by a gentleman by the name of B.S. Skinner. It's actually called the Motivation Matrix, which breaks down the whole structure of operant conditioning into its basic concepts. And there'll be more information on this a little bit later in the video, and I'll break down this matrix into its small components and talk them through. But I just want to talk globally at the moment as to what we'll be looking at. The whole concept of operant conditioning is about setting a procedure in place that through the concept of training, we teach the dog that everything that it does going forward has got ramifications or cause and effect that it is actually able to control based on its behavior. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and I don't want to go into the whole concept today about animal cruelty or different types of reinforcement over another. Today is purely just talking about the psychology and the science behind a learning process, and to explain to people what those concepts are and what the main four pillars are that relate back to learning with regards to operant conditioning. It's an incredibly powerful tool going forward for training, and it needs to be really understood. So let's head over to the computer and let me break down the operant conditioning matrix into its smallest components so I can give you an indication of what it's all about. So this is the operant conditioning matrix in its totality. Now, it does look like a complicated piece of information, but trust me, when we've finished this video presentation, you'll understand it better than most dog trainers. So the first part is I'll break down the different components of the matrix from an overall perspective to see how the different pieces go together. And then I'll break down all the relative sections that are important in much more detail so that you fully understand how the whole thing relates to itself. So the first thing that I want to explain to people is that the matrix is basically in two sections. The section in green is all about reinforcement, which is strengthening of desired behavior. So that's all about promoting the behaviors that we want or that we consider good in a dog and how to make them happen more often and more predictably. And then in red, it's all about punishment, which has to do with weakening of what we consider to be undesirable behaviors. Now, when we're looking at the matrix, we need to remember that the dogs don't know what behaviors are appropriate to us. They're just doing things in general. So the matrix is all about bringing things to the surface for the dog as to what's important to do and what's important not to do. This part of the matrix, if you see the plus signs, is all about what we call the positive component. Now, positive doesn't mean good. Positive in this instance means I am adding something into the equation to change the dog's behavior, either to strengthen it or to weaken it. So the positive component is the trainer bringing something to the training process. Conversely, the negative signs is all about minus, which is about removal of something from the training process to either strengthen a desired behavior or weaken a desired behavior. So again, negative in this instance doesn't mean bad, it just means we are removing something from the process. So now that we've got an overall understanding of how the whole matrix goes together, what I want to do is to break down reinforcement and punishment, both in their positive and negative components, and give you some very, very specific examples of how to actually understand
what constitutes reinforcement, positive and negative, and what constitutes punishment, both positive and negative. When we're dealing with reinforcement, one of the most common terms in dog training is called positive reinforcement, in which case a stimulus is added to the dog to produce a desired behavior, with the expectation that the more we produce positive reinforcement, the more the behavior gets strengthened and the more it increases. So positive reinforcement could be anything really. It's effectively anything that the dog finds what we call appetitive or enjoyable. So a lot of people use food. So food definitely can be positive reinforcement. A lot of people would throw a tennis ball. That is definitely positive reinforcement. Some people would like to do tug of war work. That's definitely positive reinforcement. And my preference, along with a few other of the ones that I've just mentioned, is a physical pat or hugs or affection. That's positive reinforcement. So in the context of training, giving the dog something that it actually enjoys while it's doing a behavior that we consider appropriate is all about strengthening of that behavior to make it increase more often, which is effectively positive reinforcement. So the next part in understanding reinforcement is the concept of negative reinforcement, which is effectively removing something unpleasant that the dog is experiencing in order to strengthen a desired behavior. So I'll give you a really good example of this. If you have a dog that doesn't like to sit, whether you're training with a flat collar or a harness, makes no difference. If you pull on the leash and you say the word sit and you're applying constant pressure, so the dog is under constant tension, and it finally rocks itself back into that sit, and as soon as its bottom hits the ground, you loosen up the lead, provided that it stays in that sit. The removal of the tension on that lead is the removal of the pressure which the leash is causing that actually reinforces the sit and makes the dog go, got it. If I resist, the process takes longer. If I don't resist and comply, I can remove the pressure that you're applying, and hence you're reinforcing a desirable behavior, which is sit. It's a really strong tool because the dog knows as soon as it feels that pressure, it can overcome it by simply sitting. Now, negative reinforcement doesn't mean introducing pain or high intensity responses. It can be something as simple as leash pressure or just something that the dog doesn't like. And the removal of it definitely strengthens the behavior. On a side note, those of you that actually train and with food, and if you go to your training center and they say, look, if your dog isn't food motivated, don't feed it the day before and actually get it hungry so it performs better. Let me explain to you that that is effectively negative reinforcement training. And it's quite controversial, but if your dog is hungry, the pressure is hunger. And if it actually does the right behavior, you give it a food treat and it removes a bit of hunger. That bit of food to do a desired behavior is removing the unpleasant experience, which is hunger. So an element of training with food, if you're making your dog hungry, is effectively negative reinforcement as well. So let's talk about punishment. Effectively, punishment is something that we want to introduce to dog training to weaken a behavior that we don't like in a dog. Now, punishment has got a really bad rap in the dog training industry because it draws immediate connotations of animal cruelty, of hitting dogs and smashing dogs and using all sorts of training methodology that can potentially make the dog really, really feel bad. In the context of science, punishment is just introducing something that the dog finds unpleasant in order to weaken a behavior that we think is inappropriate. So the first thing that I want to talk about is positive punishment, which is effectively bringing something to a training application to tell the dog that was a bad decision, don't do that again. So those of us that have got dogs that either on a harness or a flat collar and they're on a normal leash and you tell them to sit and they don't sit and you gently pull back the leash like a little tug and then the dog goes into a sit, that leash tug is effectively positive punishment. So what we said to the dog is, the instruction is sit, you chose not to do it, here's a little pop on that leash to tell you that you should have done that behavior. That positive punishment component, which is the leash pop, tells the dog that it should have listened in the first place. As long as the dog understood the task, was able to carry it out, and just unwilling to do so. So the other half of punishment is what's called negative punishment, which is effectively the removal of the stimulus to again weaken an undesirable behavior. In this instance, the removal of the stimulus is to remove something that the dog actually enjoys. So if we're training with food treats and the dog, you say sit to the dog and the dog usually sits and you give it a food treat, withholding the food treat because the dog didn't sit quickly enough or straight enough is effectively negative punishment. It didn't sit quickly. We wanted it to sit quickly. The dog was expecting a reward, which was the food. It didn't get it. So in this instance, negative punishment is the removal of something that the dog enjoys to weaken an undesirable behavior, which is the non-complying of asking it to sit quickly or straight.
So now that we've gone through the motivation matrix from start to finish, and we've looked at reinforcement and punishment within their structure of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment, I hope I've given you an outline as to why reinforcement and punishment needs to be looked at in totality rather than just in isolation. If you purely look at positive reinforcement and ignore the other three components, we are effectively just looking at one section of a big picture, and we are bound to make mistakes. Likewise, if we're concentrating on just positive punishment and we're ignoring all the other components of the matrix, we're making a mistake. So the whole concept around good dog training is what's considered to be a balanced approach, where we look at all the parameters that affect learning and then adjust each one of them subject to what the dog is giving us, what the behavior is in the dog, how we want the dog to learn, how to maximize learning, how to promote positivity in the relationship. So all of the contributing factors of the matrix are really important to understand because they are vital bits of information to help us explain to the dog what it is that we want to do with them. So thanks again for watching the video and really appreciate your continued support. I hope you found it interesting. I'd really love to get comments from everybody with regards to what you've heard today. If any of this made sense and it actually struck a chord with you, please leave a comment and I'll definitely respond to it if you ask me a question. If you found this information a little bit challenging and you're not quite sure and you need further explanation, by all means leave me a comment and I'll explain it in a lot more detail. This is a pretty complicated topic and a lot of dog trainers struggle with it. And if you have a particular point of view as to why you would consider one mode of reinforcement better than another one and why you would use punishment or wouldn't use punishment, I want to hear from you as well, because dog training, like I keep saying, is all about an exchange of ideas. Working in a bubble is definitely not a way to learn, so the more we stay in touch, the better it is. Okay, folks, thanks again for everything. Hope you enjoyed today's session.